Next, Book TV visited the Virginia home of Patrick Buchanan to learn about the books he used in writing his most recent book.
Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, How Britain Lost Its Empire and the West Lost the World, Patrick Buchanan's newest book.
Here's where almost all of the books, or I'd say 80% or 90% of the books that I use. Now this shelf
In your research for your latest book?
This latest book. Now this is also a republic, not an empire, because this is the diplomacy in the run-up to all of America's wars. And it's the American side of the quarrel and the argument. Although this, for example, this book, Backdoor to War, also deals with the British side, and so does this. William Henry Chamberlain and I can't think of his name right now. But okay, these are the American side. Here's FDR and Stalin. But these were more for the republic, not an empire. But my book deals with the British Empire. And here's where you start. You start back here in the British Empire. You go back to Salisbury's time, basically, and you come up. I'm sure you'll recognize this Boer War is a fantastic book. Churchill, you know, was involved there. And, of course, Barbara Tuchman is there. You've got Ferguson's Pity of War, which is outstanding.
Who is Barbara Tuchman, and why did you use her so much? You quote her often in your news.
The reason I quote her is she's a phenomenal writer. And she deals in anecdotes and stories that describe characters, and she's been criticized by some professional historians. But I just think as a writer, her Proud Tower, her Guns of August. I remember when I first met Shelley, she invited me out to visit her parents in 1967. And she had a big house on the lake, and I sat out there, and she brought me Bloody Marys all day, and I read The Guns of August. It was July 4th. It doesn't get any better than that. So this is all the Americans now. Here is as I say, we're down here to the British, and so you come up here to pre-World War I, and then I skipped the battles and things, almost all, because, that's not what interests me. What interests me is the diplomacy. And all of these, once you get here, these are some of the best books you will find.
McLean,
Paris 1919 is outstanding. There's other books here. Walter Millis's Road to War is outstanding. This is The End of Order. Here it is. This Thomas Fleming. This is not the fellow at Chronicles. It's another fellow. He's a wonderful writer. He wrote a book on World War II, too, and he's terrific on it. And there was a new book by David Andelman. Is that here? I fortunately got this one, and I sent him, and I told him, I wrote him a note thanking him. I saw this. He was speaking at AEI and this was just after my book was being handed in almost. And I got this book, and he is terrific on not the breakup of Germany, because I knew plenty about that, but on what was done to Hungary, and what was done to Austria after World War I. And the tremendous bitterness and animosity, you see him just handing out people back and forth to different places, and you say they made a dog's breakfast out of Europe. And he describes in detail what was done and how it was done. So this was really, really a useful book. And I wrote him and thanked him. I think I talked to him. I don't know if I talked to him or not. But I wrote him and thanked him because it came right at the end, and I had to start expanding the chapter. One of the problems you got as an author is, it's like a painting. When do I stop? When is this thing finished? And you got to hand this in. Fortunately, if you've been to college, hand the term paper in, Buchanan. It's done. Your deadline is here. And so I read a terrific book. I'm not sure if it's still here on Munich. I'm sure it is. And I read it after. It's by a fellow named Wheeler Bennett in 1948. He's a man of the left, I believe, and very anti-German. But it was a terrific book on Munich and wonderful anecdotes, but I didn't get a chance to get them in there. But let me continue along here. This is, as I say, you move up to Versailles, which is key. Then you get into, this is a biography of David Lloyd George. This is the famous A Peace to End All Peace. It's frankly about the...
David Fromkin.
Yeah, about the Middle East. And this is Wilson's War. Here's the great man's book. As some Brit said, that Winston is writing a biography of himself, and he's calling it The World Crisis.
Would you vote for Winston Churchill if he were around?
I think Winston Churchill was a phenomenal war leader. Undeniably, that period from May 10th of 1940 up through the Battle of Britain, I would say, into the fall, he was a peerless war leader. He was inspirational. He was defiant. He was spitting in the Nazis' face. We're not going to surrender. In the films and movies about that, that's when he immortalized himself. And someone asked him, he said, what year, would you, is the greatest year of your life, or what would you like to live over again? He said, 1940, every time, every time. But then when you move into 42 and you see him going to Moscow and dealing with Stalin, sneaking in there in 1944, and basically, not only Yalta, but even before Yalta, he's in there dividing up Europe, telling Stalin, look, you get 90% of Bulgaria and Romania, we split Yugoslavia. I mean, what's the Atlantic Charter all about? And then he goes to Fulton, Missouri in 1946, say, hey, they got an Iron Curtain across Europe. He's sitting there with Stalin drawing it up. And some of the statements of Stalin's, one that really got me was, and I almost couldn't believe it, and I forget exactly my source, but I checked it about 3 times. I think it's the Red Tsar, Court of the Red Tsar. Churchill shows up in Moscow in 42 after Hitler has invaded Russia. And of course, Churchill was right about Bolshevism in 1919. He was saying we ought to invade, the Allies should take down this regime, kill this snake in its crib. And so he shows up, and he's very nervous because Stalin brings up the fact, you had a lot of nasty things to say about us, Mr. Churchill, 25 years ago. And so Churchill says, can you forgive me? And Stalin said, it is not for me to forgive, it is for God to forgive. I said, that's what I wrote. I just wrote a line after that. This scene is almost unimaginable. But it's those anecdotes, frankly, that I love very much, and you get them in, you just find a way to get them in there. And they're so telling, and and I think they make a book really readable, which is what I try to do. So you go here. Now, this is all Churchill stuff. This is Churchill's. Now, these two, now Manchester and what's his name here, Manchester and Gilbert.
Martin Gilbert.
Yeah, I think Gilbert's been sort of critical of Manchester, but one thing Manchester does, Gilbert clearly is the guy who's the ultimate source, but he's not that great a writer. And Manchester is a terrific writer, and unfortunately Manchester had to give up before he finished his 3rd volume. This is a critical biography by Paine, this fellow Paine. A lot of these books, I didn't just read now. I've been reading these books, some of these books for years, when they come out, and I just put them in my library. This is the famous critical book in the 1990s by John Charmley, who said, in effect, took, people call it now the Charmley line. I was asked by a Newsweek guy, are you taking the Charmley line in this book? And so I said, well, mine's a lot more than that, I'll tell you. So, and both are by Gilbert here. This is terrific, by Roy Jenkins. It's a much more recent book, Sir Roy Jenkins. And here's this Violet Bonham Carter. She was, I believe, that I believe is Asquith's daughter. Anyhow, she was enamored of Churchill her whole life, and it's very, very sympathetic to Churchill. Andrew Roberts is a friend of mine. Let me tell you a little story. One of the things that motivated this book, I went to the funeral of my friend Sir James Goldsmith, who was an individual, they're called the Green Mailer, and he's a famous fellow in Britain, and he had an enormously rich billionaire. And he'd been very nice to me. And so I went to the funeral, and Andrew Roberts invited me to his apartment and with his wife, and he invited Paul Johnson, the historian, and Alan Clark. And I showed up there about 12 with Shelley, and we started off with the champagnes, firing those down, and we had lunch, and we had white wine and red wine, and after dinner liqueurs and drinks. But the whole lunch, I raised the issue, why did you give Poland the war guarantee? And as I recall, Johnson agreed with me, Alan Clark certainly did, and Roberts did not. But I said, why did you do that? And so it was a tremendous argument and debate. And that's one of the motivating things at lunch. I said, I really would like to write about that, because I think that is the fatal blunder that brought down the British Empire. But I remember after it was over, I was just blotto. And so I said, I've got to get going. I wasn't feeling well. I'd been drinking so much. And I walked out into the sunlight, and this blast of sunlight hit me right in the eyes, and I couldn't see. And I think it was Paul Johnson yelled, "Where are you going? We've just started the pre-dinner drinks." That's what the Brits do. But it was very funny, very funny. But I remember that story. And then you got a life of Neville Chamberlain. I mean, I have a different view than folks. I think Neville Chamberlain was more a tragic figure than anything else. And he was not a bad man at all. And I hope I'm fair to him in the book because, of course, he's made a fool in history, and I suppose...
Peace in our time.
Yeah, peace in our time, but peace in our time, and where did he get the phrase? One of them was from the Anglican Book of Prayer, and the other was from his Austin, his half-brother, who had negotiated the Locarno Pact. And Chamberlain Neville thought he had come home, and he had succeeded in completing his brother's work, The Peace of Europe. And that short statement, I think, of Neville Chamberlain's from 10 Downing Street, for the second time a British Prime Minister has come home from Germany with peace, with honor. I believe it is peace for our time. One of the 60 years ago went back to Disraeli, came home from the from the meeting in Berlin, and had said, I've come home from Germany. And peace for our time, or peace in our time, that is out of the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, I think, and it's Austin Chamberlain, the title of his speeches that after he won the Nobel Prize. It's a fascinating story. So he's, let's see, all three. This is a book by Gene Smith, who's sort of a popular writer, and he's got a lot of great stories in here. Of course, this is the 6-volume history of World War II.
When did Winston Churchill write that? 1948?
This is the first one. Gathering Storm was published in 48, and this was published in 1953. So it was a 5-year project. Actually, there's a lot of misspellings in there, but it's, of course, a tremendous read. And in 1949, he got he got the Man of the Year. I don't think he should have gotten it that year because, Mao Zedong took over China, which seems a little more dramatic than him writing a couple of books. So, but and some of these these are very old books. Oh, this is really an interesting one. This is where this is step by step. These are columns that Winston Churchill himself wrote every 2 weeks between 1936 and 1939. And in here, and in Great Contemporaries, which is another book which he published in 37, he has a number of complimentary things to say. This is a much earlier version. In these two books, he's got these little markers where I get the clips. He's got a number of complimentary things to say about Adolf Hitler. And the astonishing one is after Munich. After Munich, he denounced Munich, what a horrible deal it was on the 5th of October, which was after Munich. Let me see if I can find it. Let me see if I can go to the 4th of October. I used a lot of these quotes. Where we are, German maneuvers. Data somewhere in here. Let's get the date. Oh, October 20th, 1938. It would be right before that. Oh, here we are. Look at this. Now, this is written. What's the date of this? Let's see here. Okay, this is October 4th.
1938.
1938. Munich, September 30th. Chamberlain comes home. Here's Churchill writing about the Munich Agreement. France after Munich. Here's the last paragraph. It is a crime to despair. We must learn to draw from misfortune the means of future strength. There must not be lacking in our leadership something of the spirit of that Austrian corporal who, when all had fallen into ruins about him and when Germany seemed to have sunk forever into chaos, did not hesitate to march forth against the vast array of victorious nations and has already turned the tables so decisively upon them. It is the hour not for despair but for courage and rebuilding. So, and that is the spirit which should rule our minds. You don't think of Churchill as talking about the spirit, the martial spirit of the Austrian corporal. So, but those are really terrific. We got some terrific quotes from Churchill in here that somewhat contradict the image he paints of himself in these books. You go back and you read what he was doing and saying. He rewrites history in all these cases to say, what did the Americans drive us to break the treaty with Japan for? And he was in favor of it himself. He didn't stand up against it. And a number of other occasions you find Churchill rewriting history to his own benefit. And the really unfair one when he really charges Chamberlain. It's a great passage where he says, how in heaven's name could we honor this guarantee? I mean, it's what a rash act it appears to have been to have made it at that time when everything was against us. He was the main guy pushing Chamberlain to do it back in 1939. So he was not without duplicity. But so let me go down here. These are all, some of these are very critical. They're almost out of print. They're very critical of Churchill, some of those histories.